Alright, today we're going to be looking at the solo projects in the bundle and also the micro games, because that's going to go by really quickly. Most of the IRL solo games, which are solo games but they have real life elements instead of being your typical kind of game, are also going to be pretty quick to go over. The first solo game we're taking a look at is Peak Calm by Kai Kasan, who also made the Clutch Decisions game, which was a road generation toolkit that we took a look at in the toolkits video. Now this game is, like I said, a solo game that generally you're sort of playing as a person tasked with conserving or refurbishing a park that has been in decline. And you do this by every day taking 12 turns to sort of explore the park, uncover new hexes and points of interest and tasks that they contain, and then going back and forth to complete those tasks, or sort of just setting yourself together on one however you like. Each day you've got 12 turns to do this. Ideally, you want to return to your shelter before those 12 turns are up, but there's no huge punishment for it. And the days are somewhat important because the wildlife sort of changes and shifts around during those 6 days, and then it resets in the next 6 day cycle. But, it's very much a cozy game. There's like no chance of death or anything. It's just all about exploring this park and interacting with it how you wish to as you uncover more points of interest and tasks and such. As it says here, you are free to define your own goals, but here are some suggestions. You might want to increase the rating of the wildlife in your park to its maximum. You might want to discover all that wildlife. You might want to climb a peak of a certain height. You might want to get all the equipment that you can, or simply enjoy the mountain you have doodled and have a good time. Really doing whatever you want. Yeah, and there's no real loss condition. You can't die or anything, though you can fail at tasks. Now, some of the stuff you need is a notebook and spare paper to take notes and journal your adventures if you want. Now, you probably want hex map paper, because, you're going to be mapping this out yourself, or at least writing down what each area you encounter is supposed to represent. So obviously, if you have a physical map to write that on, or a grid you can turn into a map, that's going to work way better for you. And ideally, you want to use flexes with flat tops rather than pointy. Okay, and you will also need two six-sided dice. Standard tabletop notations. You can track days with an additional six-sided die if you like, or a 12-sided die to track the amount of turns you have left, but that's all optional. And you can obviously be as artistic as you'd like when designing the map. Ultimately, your maps are up to you, but here is this map example. Let me see if I can actually... Oh, okay, yep, goes to there. So this is just sort of indicating how they did it. The numbers are important, and we'll explain that in a bit, but they've also got a lot of notation to indicate what they've found there. We get on to character creation. There are two stats, but if I remember right, there isn't really too much focus on these. Oh, or rather, I think they suggest you just sort of pick one as 5 and one as 2, so this isn't a huge impact on character creation itself, at least. And then you can start with a small set of tools that, doesn't have the effects of the special equipment they list in here, but should cover all the basic stuff you might need. Right? Here's the park. And your park starts at a 0 rating, and it can increase from various things. Yeah, the one thing you start out knowing is that the shelter in the southern part, and then north of the shelter, are mountains. And there is a mountain called Peak Calm, which is the highest point you can see from where you are. And one of the goals is effectively to climb that if you want to take that as your goal. Mechanically, you take your hex map, you mark the shelter in one of the bottom hexes, and then you can go south if you want, but you won't get a lot by doing that necessarily. The starting elevation is 3. Yeah, we'll skip over the gears section because I don't think it's as important to look at, other than mentioning it exists. Now, I do want to go over this discover section a bit, because it is maybe the most important mechanic in the game, and probably the, how do you say, probably the hardest to grasp. Not that it's, like, extremely difficult or anything, it's just, this is a relatively simple game, and this is the part that I feel like is the most finicky. So first, you roll 1d6, roll another, and then subtract the second from the first, 1d6 minus d6, 1d6 minus 1d6. That gives you a range of anything from positive 5 for 6 minus 1 to negative 5 for 1 minus 6. Then, because in general going north is higher up on the map than going south, you would take whatever that is and add 4 for going north, subtract 4 for going south. So, just sticking with our max and min numbers for the initial range, that could be, if you've got the max height and you're going north, that'll be, a +9 total. If you got the max height and you're going south, that'll be a +1 total. Min height going north, that would be a 5, no, min height north, that would be a -1, because that is, -5 plus 4. Min height going south, that would be a -9, because that is -5 minus 4. So in other words, just looking at the max height and the minimum height you could roll. If you're going north, you would either get a 9 or a -1. And if you're going south, you would either get a -9 or a -1. Sorry, a -9 or a +1. So what that means is, whether going north or south makes a pretty big difference for the modifier. But ultimately, you can still go up 1 elevation even if you're going south, because positive is up, and you can still go down 1 elevation if you're going north. So while north is almost always an increase in elevation, it is sometimes a decrease of 1 in elevation, and while going south is almost always a decrease in elevation, it is sometimes an increase in 1 of elevation. And anytime that elevation difference is more than 5, you're looking at a cliff. Yeah, and that's just the difference here. So I think if it's like -5 too, it would also be a cliff, just downward. And then to figure out, like, in direct terms, what the elevation of the next hex is, because we were just looking at elevation, you would add the number or subtract if it's negative, depending on how you want to, notate math terms. But, basically, if you've got a positive difference in elevation, your next square is that much higher by that positive elevation. If you've got a negative, it's that much lower by that negative. So say I rolled a 3 and then a 5, that's -2. I'm going north, so -2 plus 4 ends up as +2. So that is a +2 elevation. And so, the square above here would be 2 higher than the square I'm on. Since I'm on the starting square for the shelter, which is 3, that means it would be an elevation of 5. So based on my rolls, I would be going from an elevation of 3 to an elevation of 5. Now, in addition to there potentially being a cliff, if the hex elevation was the same, it would have been a pond. And so that would only happen if my 1d6 minus 1d6 ended up being a 4 and I went south, or ended up being a -4 and I went north. Either way, that would be a 0 change in elevation, and then in that case, there would be a pond in the square I went to, just like there would be a cliff if there was a 5 higher or lower elevation to the next square I was going, or the next hex. I don't think I necessarily explained that well. You'll probably get it more just sort of reading through this. But that is about the most complex of any mechanic you're going to find in here. So, considering that, it's not too bad. And then there's some stuff about your physical stat. And if your physical stat is higher than the difference, you can move as part of the discover action, and then you just head to the encounter section. If your physical stat does not allow you to move to the target hex, and they say physical stat a lot, but if I remember right, they basically tell you to just make your physical stat a 5. And, a difference of 5 plus means you're facing a cliff. So basically, as long as you don't have something more than a tiny cliff, you can move as part of the discover action. So if you discover a hex and either don't want to or can't move to it as part of that turn, you just leave a question mark there and stay where you are, and then decide what you're doing for your next turn. Right, moving. If a hex adjacent to your current position has already been discovered, and you did not already move to it during that discovery, or, you left it, and now you want to move back to it, either way, you can move pretty easily. You don't need to spend much time hiking an area you already know, so you just roll 1d6 to see whether this takes you any significant time. If there's no cliff, it's only something that takes time if you roll a 6. And then if there is a cliff, it takes you some time if you roll a 5, and takes you a solid amount of time if you roll a 6. If you move to a hex that is empty, you will have to verify whether a new encounter takes place. Roll 1d6 and add the value to your approach rating. At 7 or more, a new encounter takes place, and then head to the encounters. So that'll be explained in more detail a bit more later. And you can decide which is your time spending one and which is your new encounter one. And that would make it easier because you can roll them at the same time, but that's really just sort of an ancillary detail. Alright, so rest we're going to mostly skip over. We're going to look at coming back late because that's kind of important. Yeah, if you end up staying out longer than you want to, you would reset your working time pool to 10 turns, so you get less turns the next day. You would advance to the next day as usual. You just basically get to do less if you come back late. And also, you also lose stars, which is definitely not something you want to do. There is still an option to lose stars resting normally, but it's guaranteed if you come back late. Now, encounters. This is like the other main part of the system, I feel like, other than discovery. Because when you, well, it's sort of part of discovery in a way, but when you actually enter the hex for the first time, which you can do in discovery unless it's a super high place, in which case you'll have to take an additional turn to move. When a random encounter takes place in hex you have already discovered, because some encounters, when they get resolved, give you the option to do moo, give you an option to have more encounters, you have to generate a random encounter. And you would roll d6, 2d6, and check the number. Yes, for a second, I just saw it went up to 13. I was extremely confused, because I was like, wait, how do you get 13? Is there a +1 I'm missing? I was just trying to figure out, and then I actually read it, and it's, you're bad at cheating, aren't you? So that's, a little joke for if you were, adding to dice rolls to get higher, you could end up at 13, but that would be quote-unquote cheating, even though there's no benefit to cheating in this system. And as well as just being funny, that is also there to complete the table. Because, otherwise you've just got this missing box there. I'm sure some people don't agree with this decision, but I think it was pretty funny, even though it threw me for a loop for a minute. And this is not the first time I've looked at this, so I don't think I was even surprised the first time. I don't know what happened. Yeah, and the encounters are described in depth in the following sections and correspond to an issue or task to be resolved, each task being a mini game, which mostly just involves dice rolls, if I remember right. And when you generate it, head to the section, take notes, and either resolve it or go elsewhere. Now, I'm going to look at a few of these, but I'm mainly, or at least one, but I'm really mainly interested in figuring out whether things are repeatable for now. Yeah, the hex of their original camp is now considered empty. So once you resolve that event, it becomes empty. On the other hand, you could find a natural landmark. Yep, and you would answer the corresponding questions about what sort of natural landmark you have discovered, therefore building out the park. And some of these generate stars. Yep, you think about the landmark, you could try to draw or journal it if you would like. And it is surrounded by other hexes that have already been discovered, and that may, affect its appearance or how it stands out. You actually always increase it by 1, and then you get a little bonus based on those stars. And it is not considered empty. We've sort of looked at some of the basic encounters here. You can get a random landmark that has some nice features you can describe and figure out yourself and see how it compares to the rest of the landscape, and that is not empty. Or you can encounter a group of tourists and you try to help them. There are different ways you can try to help them, and different advantages and disadvantages to using those ways. Yeah, and you gain 1 star for resolving it, and importantly as well, this is considered empty, because that situation has been resolved, and there's, unlike the landmark, there's not really a point of interest in that area anymore. Yeah, there's a whole flora management thing. There's a lot of different fun and interesting encounters that you can have. And that's like, other than the main, I don't think resolution mechanic is really the right term for this, but I'll call it that, even though the main resolution mechanics of, discovering squares, moving to them, and then seeing what encounter you get. Each encounter is its own individual thing that affects how you interact with it. I'm just scrolling past these for now. Here's a rules summary. Yep, and it talks about custom rules and encounters, because this is obviously a very, there may be additional content eventually. It has a modular design, and by that, for this, they mean, you're supposed to be able to add to it and switch it out encounters as ever you like. Like the main gameplay loop, I guess you'd say, of spending turns over days and then discovering higher and lower elevations of hexes and finding out what might be in them is kind of set, but the options for what you might find in them are something that you can decide to alter freely if you would like. If you move to a hex that is empty, you will always verify whether a new encounter takes place. So, when you go to a place that has an encounter that gets fully resolved, like the Lost Tourists, there's always a chance when you move to it that a new encounter will happen. So this is a game about exploring and discovering a map, discovering landmarks and wildlife and other people that you have to help, and trying to improve your park and just build it out and interact with it however you like. So it's a nice, cozy wildlife game around that without many huge consequences other than, how people think of your park and whether it's a nice park or not. Check that out if you're a fan of sort of cozy wildlife solo games or any of it appeals to you. Just sort of exploration. Like, this is sort of a random thing to add, I guess, but you could, given that it is modular, you probably could switch out the encounters for, like, weird alien species and make it a space game if you wanted. Like, it wouldn't be too hard to change things pretty radically if the theme didn't fit. So, as long as at least mechanically, though perhaps not thematically, low stakes exploration game appeals to you, even if the park theme doesn't, I think the theme would be pretty easy to switch out for this if you wanted. Next, we are looking at Voidwards, which is a Firelights game, along with another game in the solo section. Now, before we start, just a few things I kind of feel like going over. I actually recorded the other Firelights game first, but I'm not really sure I did a great job at that recording, so I might put this one first in there just to hope it maybe gives some context or something. But I do kind of want, them to be standalone and less people are going by timestamp, so I'm not gonna, just explain the central Firelights mechanic for one and then not for the other. There's gonna be a bit of redundancy here coming up from this one to the next one. And the other thing I wanted to say was these solo ones are definitely taking me a lot longer than they should, even compared to some of the larger works that I've gone over. I think that might partially be because I've played solo games so rarely that they're still kind of alien to me. I have trouble really summarizing them or knowing what, a person familiar with them might recognize or might not, so apologies if, like I am now, I just get a little bit of I get a little bit rambly or overemphasize and repeat things more than I should for these. But anyway, we have Voidwards by Harper J., which is guided by Firelights. Here's some of the other titles. There's this. That's table of contents. I keep forgetting to mention some of the art on these, but they have art. Looks like these may function as links. Yep, that's always nice. Now, as well as having mechanics, this game has a decent chunk of lore, which is nice and interesting to read through. I'm gonna try to be a bit quick about this one just because I think it's one, that it would be hard to really just summarize, and I think it's better if you explore it a bit on your own. But it was created for the Firelights Jam. There's some content warnings for here. Consider, violence, death, possession, corruption, body horror, max extinction, destruction of worlds, destruction of realities. Basically, this kind of makes it sound pretty dark, as a content warning often would, but, it's fantasy about a great void that is sort of eating reality. It doesn't really go into detail on any of that, so there's nothing I would think you would really need to be concerned about, but it's nice to have a content warning just in case, and here's some of the lore. Yeah, so there's the void, then out of that, chaos or nothingness, depending on which you consider which, sort of reality emerged, and then the perpendicular was the border between them, so to speak. The void reached out to the cosmos to try and sort of consume it and created these voidward entities that would do it. Yeah, and it corrupted living creatures with its tendril to create the voidwards. There was a guild that formed to stop it. They constructed an infinite wall at the border between the two places, or the perpendicular. And I do like the name, the perpendicular, though. Depending on how you consider things, maybe it should be the tangent or the parallel or something, but I'm not a math guy, so I couldn't really tell you. It all depends on how you visualize these two different dimensional spaces interacting. But perpendicular is quite a fun word for it. Anyway, this worked for a pretty long time, but there was one guy in the guild who decided they were no longer needed. He did some mutiny, the guild was destroyed, and Cosmos returned to taking over the universe. Or, sorry, the Void returned to taking over the cosmos. I don't think I'm really going over this that well, but that's not because I don't like it or anything, it's just trying to figure out how much to actually state. Yeah, I needed to make sure there was one thing I missed that's pretty important. You would bind an untainted being, a hunter, with a void ward, and that is how you create sort of these Rivners. So the player characters in these are normal people bound to voidlings, no, void words, and they sort of act as one entity in some ways, and the void word, upon being turned to your side, becomes considered a voidling. But anyway, someone manages to sort of rediscover the secrets of the guild after its restructuring, and starts it with you. And here it re-goes over some of the words that might be important. Here it explains various terms that are important mechanically as well. Yep, some of the stuff you need your standard deck, you need the 2d6s, a hex map. You know, there's already a lot of similarities to a peak calm as well, even though I don't think these systems are related in a literal sense. Like, you know, this is based on a game called Firelights. I don't think peak calm is, even though they both use d6s and card decks. Yeah, I think it is even 2d6 specifically that is more focused on, but alright, you would shuffle the story deck, grab action dice, and then create a Rivner. You get a name, a pronouns, you have different approaches, and you put bonuses to those approaches. They're kind of like stats. You would give a name and pronoun for the voidling you are bound to, and you get +1 to that action from that voidling. You roll on the hex tables 5 times to select 5 random hexes and mark each of their void word box, and you need to remove void words from those hexes that have them. And that's like the ultimate goal of the game, though the story does not necessarily end with it. Yeah, you're trying to destroy void words, recruit more Rivners, and rebuild the infinite wall that protects everyone. Or all of, yeah, that protects the cosmos from the void words. Now, you do things mainly via actions. You would draw 2 cards. You would roll and add the die together and any modifiers. And then rolling higher than both cards, not both cards combined, just the result of your roll is higher than one card and also higher than the other card, not their sum. And if you get higher in that way, you get a complete success, which is called a hope, or if it's just higher than 1, it's a partial success called a chaos, and if it's lower than both, that's a complete failure called a despair. You discard cards when they are used. Yeah, a little info on what the cards are worth. Yeah, each action is an action plus a modifier, and it states what happens on each kind of success. You start on a specific hex. You can't really choose where you go to, so you have to discover new realities. You draw a card, write its value on that hex. If the number on the new card is higher than the current hex, it borders the top edge. If it's lower, it borders the bottom edge. If the number is equal, you choose where that hex is, however you want, basically. Hexmax includes a space to give a name, a brief description of each hex, and you have a rolling table to sort of inspire you about what that hex is, which is its entire own reality, might be like. Yep, and there are a couple boxes for the infinite wall and voidwards to tell what's going on with that space. So the basic action is to sort of face a challenge. And you just succeed or fail, but you also, for a good success, get a void bond, and for a bad success, get a fatigue. Another thing you can do basically, I think for this, you gain. It's to approach a hex that you know a voidwood is in, I think. Yeah. It has to be when you're in the hex that a voidwood is in. When you're already in that hex, you have to find it to fight it. Yeah, and upon hope, you do get to fight it. Upon chaos, you still get to fight it. On despair, you still get to fight it, but, it just depends whether you get fatigue, void bond, or no bonus. If I did have to make a suggestion here, I think if you're going to bother having this action, it's sort of good to have there to be a chance to not encounter a voidwood at all, and then sort of to figure out what happened in that reality without that fight until you manage to get to it. Just sort of keep trying and doing other things when you can encounter it until you do eventually encounter it and fight it. Once you've tracked a voidwood, roll 2d6 plus 2, and that tells you their strength. And as a follow-up action to tracking a voidwood, you fight it. Yep, and then you would make a roll with a couple stats, effectively, or approaches, I guess they're called. And then you would repeat until the voidwood of the card stack matches the value of the card stack matches the voidwood strengths. You do a roll, and upon hope, you can stack both cards. Upon chaos, you can only stack one. And on despair, you get attacked and you have to try to survive, which is its own action as well. Yep, hope, you avoid it. Chaos, you get 1 fatigue. Despair, you get 2 fatigue. So fatigue is kind of like your health. I discover a new reality, and this is something I believe we went over, or perhaps not. Let's look at exploring the cosmos. Yeah, okay, I think this is sort of an extension of exploring the cosmos. When you search for a new reality, you make a roll based on your approaches as usual. You check the table for inspiration, and with hope you can actually add 2. With despair, you pick 1 using 1 card. With chaos, you pick 1 using 1 card, and on despair, you mark an adjacent hex destroyed. It was devoured by voidwards before you got there. Yeah, and you must travel the cosmos to move between realities. Let me double check something here. Okay, I think mainly the number of the card helps with the random table, but I'll have to double check that. And to move between the hexes or realities, upon hope, you mark a void bond and move to a discovered check. Upon chaos, you move to a discovered hex, but no bonus. On despair, it's one of those where you always get the results you want. It just depends on whether you get void bond or fatigue or no benefit or malice. Gaze into the abyss. When you stare into the abyss, ask a yes or no question. Action 2, +2 if likely, action +0 if unlikely, or else action +1. Upon hope, yes and. Upon chaos, yes but. Upon despair, no and. So basically, this is if you want to figure something out about reality as the person sort of journaling the game. If you have something that, the pre-existing rules don't really tell you about, or the table doesn't help you generate, that helps you decide what reality is. So it's sort of a story writing tool. Now here is sort of the more long-term actions that have different effects. You can recruit Rivners in realities you're in. You can recruit and get a fatigue, just recruit, or fail to find any candidates in this reality, and there are none, so you can't try the action again. And having recruits can help you get better results, or re-roll stuff, basically. Ignore a failure. And then you can acquire supplies, and upon acquiring supplies, rebuild the infinite wall. And that protects it from getting hit by voidwards or anything like that. Yeah, here's resting. That's what helps you get rid of fatigue, I believe. So, why fatigue matters, and this is, I think, where things sort of get interesting, is that you can use an action to clear it. However, a tendril will try to create a voidwood in a random hex, and if that hex already contains it, it is destroyed. So by resting, you potentially create more adversaries that you have to defeat in order to win, or risk a reality being destroyed entirely. Yep, and upon despair, you would remove all fatigue. All of these you remove fatigue, I think. However, a hex with a voidwood in it is destroyed. To determine which reality a tendril attempts to enter, roll a 3d6 and check the random hex tables. If you get chaos and have rebuilt the infinite wall on that hex, nothing happens, and that's what the infinite wall is for. If you haven't, a new voidwood appears there. Mark the voidwood box. If the voidwood box is already marked, that reality is destroyed. Yeah, we more or less went over that. If you get despair, fate is unavoidable, even if you've rebuilt the infinite wall. Roll 3d6 and check random hex tables. If that hex has a voidwood, it is destroyed. If not, the nearest hex that does have a voidwood. In the case of a tie, choose one yourself. You roll 3d6, which gives you a range of 10. The second gives you a range of 5. And the third tells you the specific hex number. So I do have trouble figuring this out. I eventually figured it out last time. I just want to make sure I understand it now. Okay, I sort of get it, yeah. So first you roll here. Then you get 1 to 30, 31 to 60, or 61 to 90. If you get 1 to 30, you next roll on this table. If you get 31 to 60, you next roll on this table. If you get 61 to 90, or it says 0 here, you would roll on this table. And each of these, this table gives you the first range, then you pick one of these tables based on that to get the second range, and then this third table has all of those final ranges and just helps you decide which among them you do. So it works, definitely. Like I said, I don't think it's laid out in a way that is instantly intuitive, but you can get it. Here's an option. You can adjust the game difficulty and length, and you can create unique void words. This one is pretty interesting. I am not probably going to look at it right now because I want to get through further, but, human-sized nothingness that saps life away, that has different values for cards and has a set strength, a tear in reality that tries to draw you in. So these, I think I'd kind of recommend this, just because there are little fun descriptions there. You could also alternatively play it so that, you can play with your Rivner again, or another Rivner that they've trained. Questions and clarifications. There's some nice details here. Here is the generation table that helps you sort of discover the realities or mess around with what kind of Rivner you might recruit. Some random names, and just tables to help you fill out the story, really. Here is the map, which is nice that they provide for you. Here is your character sheet. So they give you a lot to work with, but to go over the game as a whole, there is this chaos, and then this ordered universe that in your little subsection of the multiverse, which has a bunch of realities and hexes, has been invaded by about 5 voidwards. Your job is to hunt them down. You can discover realities as you move towards them. If you want to focus on long-term goals and protections, you can recruit other Rivners to give you resources. You can gather supplies and then build worlds, build walls to protect the realities that you're in. Or if you just want to chase after the voidwards, you can keep moving from reality to reality until you encounter one and then fight it. Ultimately, the sort of main resource that you have to worry about is fatigue. Once you start filling up on fatigue, you can rest. However, doing so makes the situation worse, potentially. It will either bring a new void world into a new reality as a tendril from chaos reaches out, or if you roll a hex with one already in it, it gets destroyed. Or if you, do very badly on the check, one place with a void wood gets just destroyed automatically. So, you're traveling throughout the universe trying to save it, doing these things, but as you do so, you accrue fatigue for failures, and each time you rest to clear that fatigue, the situation in the universe gets worse. So you want to make sure you outpace the destruction and proliferation of void words by hunting them down. Yet I'm going to check something on fatigue, because I don't know if it says you die if you feel your fatigue or anything. Okay, so you are killed if they are filled. It just explains that a bit more in the character sheet, and maybe earlier in the rules, but just searching, the first place I saw it was the character sheet, and it's very good that that is established. So I think it's a very nice exploration game. Maybe it could be filled out a little on how you're supposed to journal and what kind of prompts they give you, but it's pretty good. It gives you a lot of options, it gives you a lot of resources, it has a fun story. I think this is definitely one worth checking out if this sort of exploration-based solo game is your thing. Alright, looking at the final days of Maccabee Hayes, I think I might just, read through this one mostly straight, because it's not too long. It's a little hard to summarize. You finally made it to Maccabee Hayes, an idyllic town everybody is adamant never existed. From the sickening silence that greets you when your engine cuts off, you'd be tempted to agree. You're here to investigate why all mentions of the town have been erased from memory, and what happened to the town's entire population. To be forgotten is a dreadful fate, for not only the residents, but the town itself. Please drive with care and respect our natural spaces. And there's a safety section, which is kind of funny in a single-player game, but not necessarily a bad idea or anything. It goes over some of the stuff you need. This is a sort of game where you quote-unquote generate a map with cards as you move, so you do need playing cards for it, and some dice, and a coin or just a die that you're going to use like a coin there. A token to track your space, so, a bunch of odds and ends, but nothing too hard to find. The basic checks involve drawing 2 cards, rolling 2d6, and adding any modifiers you might have, and then seeing if you score higher than both cards, or just one card, or none of them. And, a full success is a truth, partial is obscured, failure is a myth. And when you start the game, you draw a card and just put it face up in front of you. Reshuffle its face. Place your token on your card to indicate you're there, and that's where your car is. And then you just add more cards as you go. When you add a card to the map, the new card must touch the card representing your current location, and you can use the town guide leaflet to try and figure some stuff about the space. Yeah, just reshuffle if you run out. And then sometimes, when you get an outcome of an action, you'll mark fatigue. Once you've marked all of it, you gotta restart for the day and lose all your evidence as it sort of, fades away like everything else in the town. You could also choose to just quit at that point. Alright, you are looking for 6 pieces of evidence. Anytime you add a face card, that's evidence. You can collect it just by moving to it, you don't need to do anything. And upon finding the 4th one, you can use that discovery and link it back to one of your truths, which I think we'll go over in a minute. Tie your truth in with specific locations and strange happenings. Give your character the opportunity to explore what this means to them. So, as well as generating evidence, you're supposed to tie it back to some of the things you've discovered in each of the spaces. And we'll go over that a bit once we get to sort of the advice for how you imagine the spaces you encounter to be. There's like a separate leaflet for that. Yeah, you should journal your progress, but there's no specific guidance on that, at least in this segment. And once you've gathered all the evidence, try to figure out what actually happens in the town. Write out a hypothesis using the evidence that you've gathered and what you've seen in town, well, generally, of what you think happened. And then you just do one last action. And you compare one card. Yeah, you draw one card from your deck, but you also get to use an evidence card. And I think that's like an automatic 10. What does it say the face cards count as again? Yeah, face cards it was 11, so one of those cards is automatically 11. And if you fully get truth, you've cracked the case, your hypothesis was correct. You run to the car and leave the town once and behind for all and get to do whatever you want after. If things are obscured, which is like the partial success, one die you've rolled is the die total you've rolled is greater than one of the cards, not greater than the other. It would, I imagine, be harder to get greater than the 11, though any modifiers you might have will help with that. Yeah, But anyway, you're on the right track, but something is off, something is missing, and you decide what you realize in the middle of town. If you get heads on a coin flip, you make it out at the last second. If you get tails, you sort of just disappear along with, everyone's memories of the town. Then myth, which is the complete failure, you disappear as well, but it's a little more drawn out. At character creation, name and pronouns, you have 3 skills and you get to pick bonuses for them. Fatigue starts at 0. Approach affects, sort of your journaling, and you flip a coin to decide what you start with. And now here we have truths. This sort of tells you why you're connected to the town that vanished and why you remember when no one else does. A member of your family. Alright, so you have a couple options for why you're connected. A member of your family grew up there, and there's been some information passed down. You're looking for someone, but they sent you a postcard out of the blue from a town that apparently doesn't exist. You're being paid to investigate it. But you gotta figure out, well, not like your character, but you, the player, has to decide who hired you and whether you know why they hired you. How the people closest to you feel about this. This is a risk. They fuel your anxiety. They're sort of excited about it. Or you just straight up lied to them about where you are. Yeah, and depending on which stat you pick as your highest, you get a little bonus. Just to go over what we've looked at so far, you're investigating a, idyllic town that no one really has memories of and evidence of is very scarce, but during character creation, you establish some of the connections you have to that town and why you are searching for it. Once you're there, you build out the map by laying out cards and moving on to them. Sometimes you'll have to use a special action to try to get to a specific card when when finding that card failed in your initial action. Every action you take can potentially give you more fatigue, which you need to take a special action to remove. If you run out of fatigue, you have to restart everything pretty much. Maybe not the map itself, but you have to restart. That sort of covers actions and character creation. Each face card is a piece of evidence. Once you have 4 of them, you want to try to link that back specifically to some of your truths. And once you've collected 6, you have a chance to end the game, which comes down to a single roll, and that determines whether you did in fact, well, first you form your theory. The roll determines whether you did in fact figure it out correctly and can leave safely and sort of tell the world or do whatever you like with the truth, or whether you only figure out some of it and you barely escape with your life, or you vanish alongside the town. So it's an interesting game that gives you the chance to uncover and sort of invent the truths of a town yourself with evidence and with different little spaces you explore. And then, potentially vanish alongside of it if you don't do well. It's very much a journaling and storytelling game rather than a strategic game. It's kind of hard to lose unless you decide to, and at the end, well, leading up to the end, and then at the end, it's a matter of just the dice decide your fate for the most part. So it's very much a storytelling game where you're discovering what happened and an aid to help you sort of create your own story. And now we get to sort of what the bulk of things are, where they give you all the tables to help you generate what kind of things you might find. And the guidance before, tells you to connect all this back to evidence, connect this back to your theory, even if they don't tell you specifically how. So these are some of the tables. Use these tables. I don't know what happened there. Use these tables when you want to provide opportunity for discovery, whether that be rifling through items or adding more attributes to your scenes. But you roll a d6 twice, I believe, and then there's 1 gives you all of these options, 2 gives you all of these, and then 6 goes down further. And I would assume you roll that d6 again twice to see what kind of adjective goes along with it. So you could get anything from damp bone china crockery to sticky artisan loose tea. There are some more horror elements explicitly, like a whistling bucket of maggots. That would be a very fun one to get, I feel. And this sort of helps build out the mystery of the town and the eeriness of it. Now here's the actual town guide that gives you more descriptive features. It tells you how to use it. You would roll 2d6 and compare your rolled results to a particular section and row. I'm not really going to go over how the table works exactly, because I think that's relatively simple to figure out. And you're trying to get 6 pieces of evidence. Use the mementos and oddities table for inspiration, though. Think about how you're differentiating physical evidence versus normal items and various other things. Tie the evidence to the location you found it. But the suit for evidence affects things as well as the number. There's clubs means something hoarded, or maybe that's the atmosphere of the area itself. Whereas diamonds is immaculate and pristine. Hearts has some echoes of life. There's even potentially freshly baked goods that are just inexplicably there. Spades is ransacked, so you get a lot of the feel of different areas via the suit that area has. And then here are all the options for different areas that your card might be. So you might have the Hayesmere Primary School that is hoarded and just filled with old school things and piled up children's lunches that were never eaten and stuff like that. And then you try to figure out what might have happened there from that and from the evidence you find in places and all the items and your truths. Yeah, the prompts for the suits kind of help you figure out what an area looks like at first glance. And here's some advice on the different ways you can build out a location through the senses. So the whole game is very much an aid to storytelling and journaling rather than a more traditional game, I feel. But what evidence you can find, what suits it are, will help you discover things, what locations you might encounter. It's a fun, interesting way to build out a horror setting that you explore and then are either consumed by or escape in the end. Next, we're looking at Ice, Snow, and the Quest for Salvation. This is by Rat in a Suit, who also provided We Are the Land back in the mini campaign / one-shot category, and also has submitted several projects to the book club in general. Here is the introduction. Stranded in a frozen wasteland, the expedition's ship sits trapped in the ice. Around it, the crew are slowly unloading what supplies they can carry. They have been forced to abandon the ship by some cruel twist of fate, and now must attempt an arduous trek towards salvation. Will they endure this harsh environment and reach salvation, or will the cold claim them? Ice Snow and the Quest for Salvation is a solo journaling tabletop role playing game about the golden age of polar exploration. This game is inspired by The Terror and the expedition of Shackleton and Scott. All you need to play is a d8, a d6, a pen, and paper. In this section, you'll establish the origins of the expedition, who organized and funded the trip, and what they were hoping to achieve. So, as you might find standard in a journaling game, you sort of just answer those questions for yourself, with a little bit of advice and additional prompting along the way. Yeah, about 20 to 30 members, but you are supposed to select 5 characters to sort of focus on in your journaling. One should be the captain and first mate, and then you should pick some other key roles. Once you have that core crew, you give them a name, a personality, and write one sentence for their personality. And think about, why they're on the expedition and what some of their strengths and flaws are. Next, you would name your ship, which there's again some guidance for. Some additional historical quotes along here. And then the trek begins. After several months of expedition, the ship is now trapped and locked in the grip of thick winter ice. Some crisis has occurred, causing the crew to make the fateful decision to abandon ship and set out on foot across the frozen expanse in search of salvation. Now, I believe it is, the being trapped in the ice is more a matter of sort of crashing into it than just, or, it blocking the way somehow, than just what was water suddenly freezing the ship in place. But I don't really know enough about the background of Arctic expedition to say what it fully means in context. Alright, now, before the trek begins, record the starting conditions. And just to go over a bit of, how this game works, it is a journaling game, so you sort of figure out what happens to the expedition and whether everybody survives or not as they try to make it back from the brink of disaster in this trapped frozen ship, escaping it. And, you go through that and journal it as you might normally expect, but it is very event focused and sort of focused on rolling to see what events you encounter and what the results of them are. So it can almost be played like sort of just a simulation adventure where you don't journal at all. I think you could play it that way and have a fair bit of fun doing it. It's just not necessarily the intended bit of play. There's all of that almost simulation aspect, and in addition, you get to journal and sort of tell the story of the crew. Right, you record the starting conditions. Healthy crew. The expedition begins with 10 plus 46 healthy crew members. Sick crew starts at 0. Food reserve starts at 3. Yeah, and if that goes to 0, the game ends. Morale starts at 3, which measures the crew's trust in their leaders and their motivation to keep going on the trek. And then progress starts as 0. This represents how close the group is to salvation. When progress reaches 10, the crew will reach salvation and be saved. If I recall, morale doesn't come up quite that often. Next, you take a look at what is salvation, and you define what it means for the expedition. What is the end goal to get to? Is it a known outpost, distant settlement, or safe harbor? Write down what awaits the crew at the end of their journey. And I believe it can be a little more amorphous than a known thing, but I think that's gone over later. Perhaps I'm wrong. Yeah, a lot of, I think, quotes that are good for setting the tone, a lot of nice images. Then you roll a d6 to determine why the ship was abandoned. Cracked hull, sickness, and some of these actually, affect your starting stats. You can choose whether to bring sick crew members or abandon them if it's sickness. If it's food, they lose 1 food at the start of your journey. Mutiny, you lose morale and crew. Disaster, you lose 1 progress, I think from 0, isn't it? So you would actually be at -1, which is mildly inconvenient for sure. Let's see. Disaster. Yeah, we went over that. Disappearance. And that is losing 1d6 crew again, but for no known reason. Right, to progress on the journey, roll a d8 and consult the table below to determine what events occurred. As events unfold, record a log entry detailing what occurs. Imagine how the characters of the crew would react to this transpiring event. Would they be gripped by fear or stirred to do an act of heroism? Continue rolling on the table below until, if food or crew reaches 0, that's it. Bad end, if progress reaches 10, the surviving crew reaches the salvation they were seeking. They have survived the ordeal, but it will leave a mark. Either section, go to the expedition's end. Unless otherwise stated, divide any crew members evenly as possible between healthy and sick. If the losses cannot be divided evenly, prioritize losses among the sick. Alright, so here are a series of events you can go through, and here's a table for it. And a lot of these are repeatable, and each time they repeat, they advance, I believe. Yeah, this one is a little different. What happens depends on how many are sick. Now, this one I think is one of the repeatable ones. Expedition is being hunted. It strikes at midnight and leaves bloody piles of flesh. Is it a wild animal or divine punishment? And each time you roll the result, you progress through the events below in sequence. And once you reach the final event, repeat it for subsequent rolls. So, yeah. Somebody witnesses the beast, gain 1 progress, and that's it the first time you roll this. The second time you roll this, the first kill happens. You gain 1 progress because you're further along in the adventure. Well, the desperate attempted survival, but you lose 1 crew and 1 morale, and a dismembered crew member is found in the morning. Then, I believe the final one, yes, is the attack on the camp. The creature attacks the camp in the night. Tents collapse, screams fill the air, and the crew scramble for weapons. 1d6 of the crew are killed. Roll a 1d6. On a 6, the creature is slain, and the crew breathes a sigh of relief. You gain 1 morale, and any future rolls are simply re-rolled. On a 1 to 5, the creature escapes back into the darkness, and the attack on the camp event repeats. Interestingly, you do not get an addition of progress for an attack on the camp, so you definitely don't want to roll this one a 3rd time or anymore after. Let's see what this kind of one was. Yeah, this is another progression one. Maybe if I'm gonna look at another one, I'll see what that depends on morale, because that does sort of matter. Yeah, rising tensions. At 1, this event occurs. Check the expedition's morale and consult the list. If morale is 3 or higher, lose 1 morale but gain 1 progress. If morale is 2 or 1, discontented crew members begin spreading unrest, and you lose morale and don't gain any progress. If morale is 0 or less, there is a mutiny with several different responses that you can make with different results. And there's some nice little writing and flavor for each of these other than just the pure mechanics. Tensions are rising in the expedition. The cold, the hunger, and the endless march toward salvation are slowly wearing down the crew's morale. If not addressed, this unrest could ignite into a full-blown mutiny, leading to the collapse of the expedition and the death of all the crew. When this event occurs, check the expedition's morale and consult the list below to see what outcome occurs. So that's sort of the gist of the events that you can get, a lot of which I think are quite fun. But moving past that, toward the end, the expedition's end. The journey has reached its end. Perhaps the expedition reached salvation, and the crew can finally leave this desolate place behind, or perhaps the ice claimed them, leaving only frozen corpses and a ruined camp behind. Whatever their fate, this marks the conclusion of their story. Take a moment to document the expedition's final thoughts. What became of the crew? What legacy did they leave behind? Will their struggle go on to mean something more, or will they just become a footnote in history? So that was Ice Snow and the Quest for Salvation. It's a nice game where you sort of journal about an expedition and some of the crew, and then run them through a series of randomized events with, mechanics and a bit of flavor to them, where you can journal each one along the way. And either you will run out of food and people, depending on what you roll, or you will reach 10 progress and close out the expedition. Well, not really close out the expedition. The expedition is kind of a failure either way, but manage to escape to safety. So, if that sounds fun, give it a shot. Alright, here we have Tales from the Loom, which is the last solo game before we get into some of the subcategories. And it is a little bit intimidating to get into this one because it's probably the most in-depth solo game that I've seen, and I've sort of had trouble going through the ones I have already, so I'm going to try to focus a bit more on the highlights for this one, like I have for some of the full systems and such. So it goes over some advice on how to solo play, which I think is very helpful. There's a table of contents here. Alright, so you roll your relevant skill pool, and that might be like, the example they use here is combat. Say for combat you've got 3, then you would roll 3 dice, you would take whichever of those 3 dice is highest, and then compare it to 2 other dice. So you would roll, 3d6, take the biggest one, then you would roll 2d6, and see what the value of the d6 you saved before, see which of those 2 other d6s it beats. And if it beats both of them, that is considered a warp. If it beats just one of them, that is a weft, and that's a success with a complication. And then if it, is under both, that is a miss, and that is just a failure, and, things get worse. If both of them, ties go to the challenge dice, it says. Now, if the challenge dice themselves match, then basically something unexpected happens. On the 2, like, partial successes and partial successes, you get maybe a little something extra, and then on the miss, something wild happens that could be good or bad. And there's another stat that's important here, not a stat, but a value that's important here called momentum. And that starts at 0, and it has can go from -6 to 6. Right, so as well as having that range of momentum, there's something you can do called burning momentum, which the wording on confused me for a bit. But basically, before you roll, you can say, alright, whatever my momentum is, that is what my highest die is going to be for this roll. Basically, instead of rolling the pool of your skill, you would still roll the difficulty you have to beat. Instead of rolling the pool of your skill, you would just use your momentum in place of the normal highest die. If you do that with a high momentum, like a 6, you get a roll of 6, which is very good. However, your momentum resets to 0, so you lost momentum doing that. If you do it when you have a negative momentum, the die is treated as 1, so that is a pretty low roll. which is bad for you, and you lose 2 stamina or 1 wound. So you get a bad roll and you lose something. Regardless of that roll's consequences, you might lose even more from that if it's a failed roll based on it. However, you do reset the momentum to 0, which, since it was at a negative, will be an upshot. It's a way to basically, you can take, if you have good momentum, you can sacrifice that good momentum to get a good roll, and if you have bad momentum, you can sacrifice that bad momentum. Well, not really sacrifice that bad momentum. You can force yourself to get a bad roll in order to clear that bad momentum. However, you do have a slight additional cost as well. And while your momentum is negative, your orbs become wefts, and that is part of why you don't want low momentum. There might be other reasons as well, but we'll get into that. Luck is a wild card. You start with 1. Add 1 dice to your action pool when you spend luck. If the luck die shows a 1, it is an automatic miss regardless of the other die. So that's certainly a risk, but it provides some advantages. There's a higher chance of getting a high roll. And you regain 1 luck when you make camp, or trade 2 momentum for 1 luck outside of combat. And that's another reason you would want momentum, because you can spend it on getting luck. Character stats. I'm not going to go into this in detail, because, it's kind of intuitive for any fantasy-based role-playing game, but I will go into it a little, just because you don't really see that many typical fantasy role-playing games that are solo. But anyway, wounds, that's your life force. When you hit, you lose them. When you get hit, you lose them, and if they're at 0, you're just done. Armor can absorb wounds. 1 armor walks 1 wound. You mark it. Yeah, and then you can repair it with good craft rolls. It looks like it's not optional. You just always mark it instead of taking damage when you have it. Stamina, which is your fuel for ability, you start at 6. And then you get some negatives once it starts to get low, as well as being a basic resource. And then block and dodge are defenses used in a fight. Right? Yeah, these are your skill pools. So, both your skills and stats, effectively. And they determine how many die you roll when you're trying to find which die is your highest, Like, you would start with 2D, so you would roll 2d6, pick whichever one is higher, and then see if a second roll of 2d6 you would beat the individual rolls of that. And it's still 2d6 for the difficulty rolls, regardless of what your stat is. So, it would be the die of 1d6 versus the individual die of 2d6 if you had 1d for one of your skill pools, and if you had 3d for one of your skill pools, it would be roll 3 die, keep the highest, and then see if that beats either of a roll of 2d6. And oracles, and this is another big feature of the system. When you need answers, you would roll on the appropriate oracle. This is part of how the sort of storytelling works in a solo game. This adds the randomization element that might otherwise be absent if you were just inventing a story by yourself. So, as well as the oracle tables, here's like a simpler one. And you just roll 1d6 plus momentum. And then 10 plus is yes and. 1 or less is no and. So this is another reason momentum is good, because it helps with the oracle. Okay, and now here's a more complex oracle. Yep, and so this is just a D66. Basically, we've seen a couple of those at this point. And this is a more complicated oracle for where you're trying to figure out what might appear next, like might happen next directly in an event, or what something looks like, any of that stuff. Well, actually, I was a little incorrect there. This is for what things are, this is for what happens next. So, this helps you when you don't really know what happens next in the story or what hardship you want your character to encounter. This can help you with that. And when you're trying to describe areas or items or anything like that, you can use this to sort of help you generate stuff without you just writing all of it like it's a story you're writing. This helps add to the game element through randomization. Combat flow. I'm probably not going to get too into this. As far as I remember, it was functional, and I don't necessarily think it's a highlight in and of itself. Maybe if I knew more about solo systems and what they generally do for combat, I would think differently, but for now, we'll just say combat, it works. Are we getting into... Alright, here are the progress looms, which are the experience tracker. And this is another sort of highlight. You would create a loom. When you succeed on rolls that sort of add to the theme of that, you would mark progress. Yeah, so I've looked at more things here. It really is just this is so in-depth for a solo system. It's very fascinating, but that makes it hard to go over in this format. So I'm going to try and just real quickly sum up some of what we've looked at. You roll d6 equal to a pool you have for skills. You pick the highest result of that die. You compare that to 2d6 you roll and see if it's higher than both or just one or none of them, and that determines your success rate. You have this thing called momentum, which sort of tracks how well the story is going and helps you generate things off of that. You can burn it to change your die rolls. It affects the yes or no oracle, where oracles are a thing where you roll, and that helps you determine how the story's going, basically. The higher your momentum is, the better for your oracle. If your momentum's negative, your successes might go down a rating. You can spend 2 momentum to get a luck, which lets you add a dice to one of your rolls. So really, there's a lot of stuff momentum does. Yeah, and you gain momentum on full successes, lose it when you miss. It doesn't directly impact your rolls, so you're not necessarily going to get caught in a positive or negative feedback loop, but when you start doing badly, that does make it a bit more likely that you're going to continue to do badly, as the name momentum would imply. But you've got the unique rolling system, you've got the momentum system, which kind of carries through everything and you can use for various reasons. You've got the oracles, which help you sort of figure out what's going on when you're not sure what should happen next. And, those are affected by momentum as well, potentially. You've got some standard fantasy RPG mechanics and stats. There we go. Yeah, so here are some, troublesome, dangerous, formidable words that determine the difficulty of the enemy. There's this thing called a loom, which not only tracks your level effectively, but it also tracks how far along you are in a problem. The difficulty of the loom affects not only how many boxes you have to fill on it, but also how quickly those boxes are filled by various forms of successes. And when you're ready to absolve, you can make a progress roll that is affected by how many boxes you have filled on the loom. And that doesn't necessarily level you up, but it can help you defeat the overall problem, if I remember right. You've got a variety of moves that you can do, each with their own warp and weapon effects. This is a very in-depth solo system, and for some reason I have a lot of trouble summarizing those compared to the multiplayer ones, so I don't really know how efficient I'm being at this. I'm trying to just sort of... I can't even say show off the highlights because I'm showing off so much, but just try and get out a general idea of the system for you. It's got like full in-depth character creation where the races have abilities. There are potential multiple traits for those races or species. You can take a drawback if you want to gain extra trait points. There are classes, and these each sort of do more as you progress. Yeah, there's level progression for each class as well. So it is just a really full fantasy solo RPG system that if you keep going, and I've never actually had a chance to check this out because I felt like, it's mostly optional, but you even have uh, framework for adapting it to group play, which makes sense given that it's, such a full system with standard fantasy RPG mechanics. It would feel like kind of a, not really a waste, but a missed opportunity if there was no planning for how to run it with a party if you wanted to. So there's even some advice and such on that. There's reflections in play. There's reflections that are supposed to happen when you progress. There's just a lot of stuff I really didn't feel like I had time to go over. If I'm trying to treat all of these games equally. But this game just has a lot to it. And I think there's a lot in there to love if you're interested in fantasy RPGs, or just if you're sort of interested in a solo game that had different ways of, really adding mechanics to how the story might go, with things like momentum to sort of determine where things are going, things like looms to track your progress on a problem, oracles to help tell you what happens next. It really just provides a lot of value for this. And so I definitely think it's worth checking out. The only thing, like, if you're interested in solo games at all, I think you could. The only thing I'd say maybe is if you want, something rules light, this probably is not it. So next, and I'm sort of going to be grouping these together, even though they don't totally go together, we've got the subcategory of IRL solo games, and these are all solo games with some sort of real-life element, and micro games, which are their own separate category, sort of, but I'll just be going over them here since they're so quick. There's one 24-word one, another 24-word one, and one that fits on a bookmark. So those will go by really fast. In terms of the IRL, here is a game that you attempt to play by asking questions to yourself as you sleep. I suppose, in a sense, that's not really more real life than other RPGs, because every RPG takes place with questions in your imagination, but this one is in particular, the real life is, doing it when you're trying to sleep, making it part of some other activity in the day. Not just exclusively playing it as a game per se, but as a form of almost meditation, I feel. Then this one involves actually sort of performing real life actions like making a pose with your body to sort of exercise face like shapes that you see in the environment. It's quite a unique one. And then questing is sort of a gamified weekly planner. So, those three I think are quite interesting, and they all sort of revolve around real life activities rather than just a set aside time to play a game. You can really do them at any point and sort of weave them into your daily life, unlike a lot of other RPGs. Right, I'm running out of steam just a little, I will admit. However, we are now on to the IRL section of the solo games category, which is a very interesting category, but does, thankfully for me, tend to be a lot simpler than the other solo games. Case in point, let's take a look at Liminal. And you have some art here of what potentially could be a Hanged Man tarot card or something else, all in green. But here's a description of the game. Liminal is a new mental resolution mechanic For games to be played in your head when you are falling asleep, or whenever you feel like it is designed to be as simple as possible. No mental arithmetic, as few things as possible to remember or keep track of, accessible to as many body/mind types as possible. Ask yourself, that just says body/mind types. I added the slash because I thought that made more sense, but in retrospect, maybe it doesn't because I don't really know what body types would have to do with anything. So, body/mind types, whatever that is. Ask yourself yes/no questions about you, character generation, or the context you are in, scene/world building, or about what is happening, conflict, etc. Answer the yes/no questions using the answer line shown below. You will start from the left, use the answer prompt given there, and then as the story develops, move one position to the right, and answer the next question with the answer prompt there. Keep moving along the answer line, left to right. And when you reach the end, start over, cycling through all the answer prompts. So it's no and, no but, yes, and that's in shorthand, na, nib, yib, yeah, so that you can actually remember it, and this is something you're supposed to be able to do right as you're about to fall asleep, so it has to be nice and easy to remember. So basically, you'd be like, starting to drift off, just who am I? Am I a villain? And then it would be no, and I'm not a villain, and I fight villains, let's say. That's what I would think to myself. Okay, and I fight villains. Have I fought one recently? No, but, well, no, but I'm on the trail of one. Okay, trying to think of a question that would specifically be yes or no. So this would definitely take some getting used to try out. Do I like him? Yes, but he's a villain. I gotta kill him anyway. Then, final question. It would repeat, but I don't want to go that far into it. Will I kill him? Yes, and... Well, honestly, I don't want to elaborate on that at that point. But basically, that's how you'd go through it. You'd sort of just cycle through that pattern of yes, ands, or, no, no's, ands, buts, and yes, ands, and buts. And just sort of fall into a pattern of that as you're drifting off to sort of create a story in your head. I think there are, like a few questions you could have about this. Like, is that really the best way to go about things? To have something so sort of rigid and that doesn't really prompt you or excite your imagination. But I think that leads into a different question, which is, why not just sort of imagine whatever you want to as you fall asleep? Because that's something anyone can do. What's different about this is that it is a game. It has a set of rules that, while yes, being restrictive, like the rules of any RPG, allow for an interesting story to develop out of them. Without everything being under your control, that element of, restriction and not really providing anything, like they're not telling you how to tell a story, nothing like that. It's sort of restriction without giving you anything to work with, and you've sort of gotta work around that and see what happens. And in a sense, I think that's kind of the essence of a storytelling game. And sort of boiling down what you want to do to the essence is what you need to do for something that's sort of just a simple game while you play for yourself while you're falling asleep. I haven't tried this yet, at least in terms of while I'm sleeping, but it's definitely something I want to look into at some point. I think it's really creative and really cool. You might have seen this one already because it's been added to a lot of bundles, which I think is also another pretty cool thing since they're mostly charity bundles. Or maybe I'm misremembering. But, I think this is, something I could recommend to literally anyone because we all do sleep. Next up, and though it is longer, I may spend just a little bit less time on it, because I think it is slightly less high concept than a game you play while you dream, even though it is still only slightly less, and you'll see when I start sort of explaining what it is. But this is pareidolia, evil eye, and the pamphlet itself is sort of like designed as, I'm not sure partially classified is the right term, but like, I'll just say that even though it's probably incorrect, partially classified files from some sort of organization. It doesn't quite tell it to you straight. Dream energy can accumulate in many ways. Curses, thought patterns that pursue an agenda are the most common. Due to a worldwide surge, the agency, BURCOP, Bureau of Investigative Registration and Capture of Objects of Power, has deployed agents to counter this threat. They are known as the 100 Eyes of Argos. Welcome to the agency. So as you can see, like, classified is the wrong term. There's not anything redacted or anything, but it is written as if it is in-universe materials, not the rules of how to play a game. Project Evil Eye. Our sensors have detected numerous appearances of the Evil Eye curse. And I'm gonna stop reading at this point just because, while I think I could sort of read all of this and go over it relatively quickly even still, I don't want to take away from you looking at it yourself. But anyway, there's the Evil Eye curse. The entity, classified as a watcher, is manifested into existence where a human observes an object in any kind of manner, practically, that is connected to the rise in strife and unrest in any given area. Watchers take the form of faces unseen to the naked eye and bind themselves to objects in the everyday world. Example, the headlights and windows of a car, the windows on the doors of a building, or a group of objects arranged in a dark room. Watchers arrange themselves to form a pattern of simulating a face, in short, pareidolia. So, in other words, you as a player of the game, or a agent in this organization that has just been welcomed by this pamphlet, are looking out for things that sort of look like faces but aren't. Watchers follow a cursed person. Eventually, they have an emotional breakdown that cause other curses to pile on. Right? Should you witness an eye affliction or suffer from it, take action. Look out for watchers of any kind. So, like I said, look for things that kind of look like faces. Once you see them, you have to start eliminating them. And there are various ways to eliminate them. Yeah, and then you have to register them. In other words, I would guess journal about them a bit as well. You'll need a logbook for it. Can be done anywhere at any time, and as long as 24 hours have not passed since confirmed sighting. So if you see something, that looks like a face, and you don't want to do something weird in public that makes you look completely crazy, but you still want to sort of play the game faithfully, you can wait a bit till you're in private. You just can't wait more than 24 hours, is, I guess, the gist of that. The Mimic. A hunting method, body morph. Once you identify the watcher, you must imitate the shape of pareidolia using your limbs and torso. The actor. Once you identify the actor, you must imitate the shape of the pareidolia using your facial features. Then exaggerate the gesture to eliminate it. So there are various kinds of things you can do, including, take pictures of things in order to, counter these watchers. So it's a kind of open-ended how you decide to play the game, I think. Here are some, abnormal watcher characteristics. If you see something that looks like a face but has maybe more than 2 eyes, you have to double up and find another one. If there's arms or legs on the, object that sort of looks like a face as well, you have to draw on yourself, I suppose. Yeah, so there's sort of also various other details of a watcher that might throw things in the work. This is demonstrating the kind of things that might look like faces, eye, mouth. So, like I said, you can only call it slightly less high concept than a game you play in your dreams, and you might actually consider it more, depending on where you're coming from. But you look around your environment, if you encounter something that strikes you as sort of being like a face that wasn't clearly designed to be that, there are various things you are supposed to do in response to sort of play the game. And it is all written as if it were an in universe document about these phenomena. So it's a very fun, interesting, abstract sort of thing. Like, I can see a lot of people being turned off by having to do some of these actions, but, the picture one would be relatively easy, and you just have to capture its shape via camera. So you could even, like, make a drawing of it and then take a picture of that drawing if you don't want to just be taking pictures of random things. But I think this is something that would sort of make you feel like you're going insane if you tried to do it, and maybe that's the point. So, I don't know if I can recommend everyone check it out based on that, but as usual, if it's something that interests you, absolutely go for it, and I almost wish it's something that is the kind of thing I wanted to do, because it sounds very interesting, but at the same time, I personally am just I guess a little too lazy for it, if I'm being honest. But it's very fun. It's very unique, very creative, and there's a lot of commitment to making it really feel real. All right, the last of the sort of IRL solo games, and then we'll be on to micro games, though those can kind of fit in the same category as the solo ones. But the last of the IRL games, anyway, questing. And this is sort of a RPG, and not just role-playing game, but a computer, well, not really computer, but video game RPG as well, themed day planner. Questing. A week planner. Come on, adventurer, you are finally awake. At the beginning of each week, write down all of your to-dos on a piece of paper, divided into categories. Main missions, secondary missions, and collectibles. Completely trivial objectives, but ones that would be nice to complete within the week. They may or may not have a transcendental purpose. What matters is that they matter to you. I'm not going to read the details for main missions or secondary missions because I want you to have some stuff to look at yourself, though. For some of the micro games, I won't really be able to leave anything up to the imagination, but we're not there yet anyway. Um, so I'll leave that off, but I went into detail on collectibles. If any of the missions are tiring or make you feel bad, mark it as final boss and add a life bar to it. Subtract chunks from the life bar as you progress through the mission. Cross out, check, or mark the missions as you complete them at the end of each day. Write on a piece of paper something you liked about the day. Draw something, mention one of your favorite things. Anything goes as long as it shows you your progress over time. Remember to make your list every week, adventurer, and don't worry if you can't complete your quests in the week. You write them down. There is no time limit to defeat the dragon. So this, I think, is a very nice concept. I like the art. It's by the same creator as Pareidolia, I believe, and it's a little less abstract in what you do. I am just going to read everything because I left out 2 paragraphs maybe. Main missions. These missions have a high priority. Completing them is relatively difficult, takes time, and requires a lot of energy to achieve. And this is at the beginning of the week. You write down your to-dos. Secondary missions. These are slightly lighter, relatively easy objectives that can be picked up at any time of the week, are completed simultaneously while doing other missions, or are quick to do. So I would guess this isn't really intended for daily chores as much as it is, tasks that you have to get done on sort of a week time scale. So, like, there might be a project you're working on, which would be maybe a main mission, or something simpler, like taking out the trash. You just have to do that once on one specific day, but it is something that you have to do that is not, entirely repetitive. I would consider that a secondary mission that you put down on there. You have those collectibles that you can just do at any time. But even then, it's still within the week. some of these collectibles might be repeatable, but it's, within the week. It's not really day-to-day chores still, I think. Obviously, you can do it however you want, but I think the focus is sort of on bigger tasks than just, say, doing the dishes every day. And then I think the, marking one of these as a final boss and subtracting chunks as you get through pieces of it is a really fun way to do things. I think, writing at the end of each day something nice, or drawing a little thing to indicate what you did on that day in the week. If you have sort of like a calendar style, I think that's very nice too. So I think this is just a fun, neat way of sort of gamifying your life for a bit if you want to try it. And there's there's some cute art, and it's another one of those things that I think you can really recommend to anyone, unless you like abjectly hate planning, or I don't know, the very idea of gamifying an aspect of your life offends you. I think this is something that could appeal to anyone. And we are finally on to the micro, often 24-word games. So, at this point, I'm just reading it out straight. There's really not much else I can do. I really love the art for Spellify. I think everything's cute and pretty and just has a nice vibe to it. Maybe a little cozy, but at the same time kind of mysterious, and I don't know if threatening is the right word, but potentially hazardous, perhaps. Almost poisony. Spellify. You know that spell, right? I believe the intro isn't part of the 24 words here. Introduction. You live in a magical world and have the power to create magical spells. However, when using your power, you always cast a random spell. Now you have decided to become an adventurer. Gather a team or go solo on your journey. Maybe you'll finally find out what your spells actually are. Okay, so now let's see. Rules. Begin magic journey. Encounter a problem. Craft 2d6 spell and conquer challenge. Gloom, Loomy, Vortex, Cron, Echo, Lunar, Rift, Flux, Shift, Spark, Veil, Gaze. And yes, I did count 24 words there. So basically, you begin a journey, and if you encounter a problem, you immediately jump to doing spells. There's no normal checks, there's no, alternate way of solving problems. For Spellify, you always immediately, if you can, reach for your spellcasting. And you just sort of roll one here, and you see what the result is. You could get a Gloom Spark, and you would have to try and figure out what that might be. Or you'd be playing with a GM, and they'd tell you. You could get a Cron Flux, you could get a Vortex Shift. And if you wanted to, if you like this idea, but the current 24 word format just isn't enough for you the way it's written, a few ideas I think you could build it out yourself are, just adding to the tables. What I think is a really fun idea is you could bank certain words when you rolled them and maybe bring them back later, create some kind of roll banking system for when you wanted to save stuff, or just a way you could have a resource that would let you skip a bad spell occasionally. So I think there are additional fun ways you could add to or tweak the system to really build it out more than its current simple 24 word form, if you were interested in this, but you were there's not a lot here for me. So food for thought, and if you like 24-word RPGs, I think this is a very cute, functional one. On to Samsara, and I think this is probably my favorite 24-word RPG I've ever seen. I maybe like the art of Spellify a bit better, but the mechanics of this always, it does take me a second to grasp them sometimes, because I've looked at this a couple times, and it's been long enough between each time I've forgotten how it works, but each time I look at it, it does take me a little bit to sort of figure out what the mechanics mean, but when I do, I just think they're extremely elegant and impressive that you could do so much with just 24 words. Another interesting thing about the game is it doesn't say on the game itself, but it's sort of an effort to teach Buddhism in line with certain principles that is interesting as well. So if you ever want to look at additional details, there might be some outside of the game itself. Right, so starting out, you were born. 3d6, even is +1 karma, odd is -1 karma, and you describe the year's suffering. Triples, replay. Or in other words, you die and you start over. Positive karma is a greater being, negative karma is a lesser being. So basically, say I'm starting as a human, I roll 3d6, I get a 4, I get a 5, and a 6. That's a 16, it's even, so I get +1 karma. I've got 1 karma. And then I would sort of describe what happened in that year, and the karma would be, whether I was good or bad, kind of. And then I would just keep going like that over and over and over again until eventually I got, say, 6, 12, 18, that's all sixes. The character dies. I've sort of recorded, or at least described to myself, all the suffering over the years that they lived. If I end up with positive of all the +1s and -1s that have been adding up based on even or odd, say a +2, I get to be a greater being. Greater than human, I will say a cow. That may be stereotypical, but I think, based on my vague knowledge of Hinduism slash Buddhism, a cow is potentially higher than a human on the karma scale, but that may just be completely wrong on my end. If it is, I apologize. But anyway, I would now be this higher being, and then I would start the same process over again. Roll the dice, more suffering, positive or negative karma, more suffering, more suffering, more suffering, and then eventually I die again, and I am a greater or lesser being again. And then, it just keeps going like that, in theory, forever. Because that's sort of the concept of samsara, and from my vague comparative religion knowledge, in Hinduism, theoretically, you eventually get such good karma that you ascend outside of samsara and achieve godhood, and in Buddhism, you sort of work towards enlightenment to escape the concept of suffering as a whole. That's just, as I said, my knowledge in this area is not great, so I can't say if I'm correct on those, and it's obviously not directly included in the game, but I really like just how, with just uh, such a small word count, they manage to get everything done. Like, the more I look at it, the more little details I find that are just correct. Like, I was thinking replay is kind of an obtuse way to sort of say you die, but I was looking at replay going back to 3d6. And if you look at replay going back to you were born, it makes more sense, and sort of just, there's a lot of intricacies like that to such a simple system. I'm going to just double check the word count. Yeah, I'd say 4 if you don't count the numbers. I think I counted 3d6, but maybe you would or you wouldn't. Again, I think this is a 24-word RPG. Maybe it was like 38 or something. I know there are different number counts. Okay, yeah, at the bottom it says for the 24-word RPG Jam. So it does say it's supposed to be 24. I'm pretty sure you're not supposed to count the numbers and the symbols, and in which case it's like roughly 24. Depends on how you count it, I think. But that was Samsara, and that is probably my favorite 24-word RPG, so definitely check it out if you have interest in those. Alright, and the absolute last game I am looking at is Dodecahedron, which is a game designed to fit on a ruler and use d12s. So, when you don't know if you succeed, roll a d12. No and is not very likely, but that's pretty bad for you, I would suppose. And there's no, no, no. No, but a bit better, and it's less likely than just straight no. yes but, which is, again, kind of in the middle, a bit less likely than yes, and then finally yes and another rarity at 12, which is yes and a benefit, I'm assuming. Yeah, 1 is always no, 12 is always yes. So those are the crit fails and the crit successes, because there are modifiers here. Bad, worse than would be -1 if your natural ability is particularly bad. If you were particularly good at something, you get a +1. There are various modifiers for things you can have that affect this D12 scale, which is nice to have. And then something I really like about this is you can roll D12s for time, weather, and direction. Like, you could just, if you only rolled one d12, that would be functional, but, certain things would always go together, like southeast would always go with rainy and stuff. But I think I would probably roll multiple for this. But anyway, I really like the idea of the compass, the time, and the weather all being on this one single radial thing you can interact with a single d12. I think that's a very fun way of doing things. And another thing I really like is they've got some sort of campaign ideas here you can use with the bookmark. And what I like the most, since this is a bookmark, is how it should have ending. If the story you are reading has an event that needs resolution, feel free to use this bookmark to determine how it should have ended. This allows you to spin a new story/event out of the threads of the one you are reading. How would you solve the problem? And I think that's a very fun thing, because that's something I used to do a lot when reading books, is, sort of put myself in the story. What would I do in this situation? And this gives you a little system to do that on the very bookmark that you are marking your page with. I'm not going to read through everything in it, because, I think it has just enough information that I can leave some of it for you to discover on your own. And that is it for dodecahedron. Alright, and that is everything for the indie charity bundle for accessibility in TTRPGs. If you've made it through this much of the video and or videos, thank you for sticking around. It's been quite a time investment for me to put this together, so I hope it turned out okay. And yeah, I would talk about how much value I think the bundle has and how worth it is, which it's true, but it's literally free, so there's nothing for it to be worth. In terms of like the real value proposition I feel that I'm trying to argue for is not just picking up the bundle. That's potentially free. I'd obviously love it if you were to donate to Dots RPG. I think they're a great cause, but the real sort of value proposition thing I'm thinking here, the only thing you'd have to spend is your time actually looking at any of these once you've bought the bundle. Because I know that doesn't always happen, and hopefully through this video I've been able to demonstrate that all of these, I believe, are worth looking at if they have the slightest bit of interest to you. There might be some flaws there. I didn't really try to go into detail on things I thought might be perceived as flaws, but sometimes stuff I just felt I had to mention as a footnote. But in addition, that was me looking at the old versions of the game for a lot of them. Some of them might have fixed any problems I had initially. And I've looked over many of these multiple times, and I've never found anything that I would say would make them not worth the effort of looking through. And that's not to say that I don't find that on some games. Some games, I look through and it just feels like a waste of time. They start out looking good, there's attractive stuff, there's cool stuff, there's creative stuff, but it just can't figure out what it wants to be, or there's a huge flaw that crops up like halfway through mechanically that means I would have to rewrite a lot to really get the system to work. For all of these, I didn't see any of that. They all work, they're all fun, cool, interesting, they're all absolutely worth checking out. Like, this one, just because it is so incredibly massive, maybe there's something in there I didn't see, but even then I feel like that's par for the course for a system that's so big. You can expect you're going to have to change stuff to fit your table, and that's almost part of the fun for a really massive, crunchy system. Anyway, donate to Dots. They do great. Pick up the bundle, and even if you can't afford to donate to Dots, and, play the games, and if you didn't donate, maybe consider just promoting it just a little bit on your social medias. Anyway, thank you for sticking around for so